Before Trump, Chinese leaders called America's approach two-handed. One hand extended in greeting, the other pulled back in a fist. Now we see three hands. One calls for cooperation, one that aims to compete, and a third that hopes to contain. The significance is that it's the first face-to-face, high-level meeting between Chinese and American diplomats since the start of the Biden administration, and the first since relations took a difficult turn under Trump's last year in office. It represents an opportunity for both sides to express their frustrations and ambitions, hopefully clear the air, and have a clear understanding of where each side stands. This meeting is closely watched by many in the world who want to see more cooperation or more competition between these two powers, depending on what their interests are. While we shouldn't expect dramatic outcomes in the near term, perhaps the two sides can discuss ways to avoid escalating tensions further, cooperate on mutual interest, and create a realistic framework for managing differences going forward. There are four ways we might describe Biden's foreign policy and his approach with China. The first is the three-handed Frankenstein. Before Trump, Chinese leaders called America's approach two-handed. One hand extended in greeting, the other pulled back in a fist. Now we see three hands. One calls for cooperation, one that aims to compete, and a third that hopes to contain. This might seem logical and reasonable from the White House's point of view, but it looks a lot like Biden is playing chicken with his domestic critics and risks a foreign policy that is imperiled by its own contradictions. Second is pragmatism, the idea that realists will look to maximize their advantages as much as possible within an existing system, or at least one that used to exist, without letting ideology beyond reasonable self-interest get in the way. But given the breakdowns and fragmentations of U.S. power and its fractured relations in tandem with its desire to fragment and fracture its competition, and given the desires that many have to avoid escalating conflicts with China, this might not be a sincere pragmatism. Perhaps we need a new word, pragmatism. Third is beach ball diplomacy. Inflate a bunch of issues, some valid and some not, into one big ball, and then play a game by trying to spike that ball over the opponent's net. We can see this with the US inflating and exploiting China's domestic issues as international issues. And we can see this with the US trying to reestablish itself as the broker of Japanese, Australian, and Canadian interest, among others. Fourth is hegemony, pure and simple. Try to reestablish military and economic controls wherever possible, and play a big strategic game targeting Russia and China and others who resist. Hold everyone to standards higher than those you hold for yourself. Punish them when they fall short, and pretend you've done the world a favor in the meantime. Demonize adversaries. Pursue regime change. This can be described as America first or America's back, but either way, it's merely might makes right, masquerading as a moral high ground that few believe anymore, including many Americans. If it's the centerpiece of Biden's foreign policy, then no, selective multilateralism won't work. But we should be clear, multilateralism is frequently selective anyway. It's often rife with competing alliances and wheeling and dealing. And this works, more or less, as long as the major players are not too heavy-handed, as long as they don't lean too hard and break down the system. It's clear that a number of long-standing as well as new U.S. friends and allies are less interested in being manipulated and are resisting that kind of hegemonic engagement. For example, South Korea isn't really interested, others aren't either, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and India, all of whom want their own independent foreign policies that represent their own strategic interest and that don't expose them to more inconsistencies and flip-flops from Washington, as well as more conflict with China. So as long as the US doesn't force people to fall into line narrowly with Washington, we should expect selective multilateralism to represent not the ideal, but the norm. That said, China can likewise compete and does. In fact, multilateralism might be an ideal that focuses on cooperation, but in reality, it's also a system for intense competition, albeit managed competition. And China doesn't really mind this kind of competition because it prefers systems and multiple players where it can make its own appeal and offer its own logic for resolving issues. It can also accept losing some battles in the international back and forth. By contrast, the US generally has either gotten its way multilaterally or resulted to unilateralism. This is what China is resisting now, and others, likewise, are concerned America might try to continue this approach. Above all, these plans chart a direct course for reaching the next plateaus in national development. They're significant because they outline the next steps forward after recently achieving the first 100, or first centenary, 100 years after the party's founding, the Shui, the moderately prosperous society goal. 2035 represents the next major milestone in China's rejuvenation, and the midpoint from now until the second 100, the second centenary in 2049, 100 years after the PRC's founding, when China aims to become an essentially strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, and modern socialist society. These plans are significant because they provide a relatively clear picture of China's long-term development strategy, and while they have plenty of time and room for adjustment, they demonstrate Beijing's resolve to step forward in its own national interest while avoiding distractions by outside forces, especially those who wish to stymie China's development.